Welcome to Plant Structure Notes. You should have a copy of the notes page, and I will go in the same order that the notes page has. And we will be going through all the definitions and drawing some pictures. First off, let's talk about types of plants. There are two main categories of plants: non-vascular plants and vascular plants. Most of our notes will be focusing on vascular plants today, but let's talk about non-vascular first. Non-vascular plants are kind of simpler plants. Think of them as the prokaryotic cells of plants. And so they don't have a really well-developed system for transporting stuff around, and so mostly their nutrients just move from cell to cell. So their size is pretty small and simple. These are kind of low to the ground plants and things like that. So some examples of non-vascular plants would be mosses, liverworts, hornworts. So these are all pretty small things. Mosses tend to be just low to the ground and just one stalk that gets all of the water and moves it to the whole plant. Where do mosses grow? They tend to grow somewhere that's pretty moist and damp, and so that's how they get enough water to get around, even though they don't have a full vascular system. Same with liverworts and hornworts. One of the interesting things about hornworts is they only have one chloroplast in each of their cells, so not super efficient, and this makes these plants just pretty darn basic. The type of plants that we're going to be focusing on are vascular plants. And when you think of plants, this is mostly what you think of. So vascular plants: trees, flowers, grasses, ferns, a lot of different things. There are two types of vascular plants: seeding plants and non-seeding plants. And we will be focusing on the seed plants. So what does it mean to have a vascular system? In humans, that means we have blood and veins and arteries and a heart, and the blood moves around our bodies and carries nutrients and oxygen around so that we can function. A vascular system in a plant does the same exact thing. It moves water around, it moves nutrients around, and it basically helps the plant to function. And it also allows the plant to get a lot bigger. So we're going to start by drawing out the different structures that make up the vascular system in a plant. And this is basically what makes the plant be able to function. So let's start at the very bottom, and we are going to draw some root structures. So in a plant, you have the stem, which we'll get to in a minute. But underneath the ground, you have the roots, and the main root is called the taproot. And that's kind of the big, giant root that you can pull out if you're weeding or something like that. One way you can think of the taproot is think of a carrot. A carrot is basically the taproot of that type of plant. So it's a big, thick root that everything else kind of grows off of. Off of the taproot, you will have the satellite roots, and the ends of those roots will be root hairs. And root hairs are those little fine roots that you find. Again, if you're working in the garden, you might see those little tiny roots. And the root hairs are really important. They're kind of like your blood vessels. And those root hairs are the way that water and things like that come into the plant, um, they they enter through the root hairs and then go to uh, the bigger satellite roots and then into the taproot and then finally up into the plant. So the root hairs are very important. Now the very tip of the root hair is called the apical meristem. So we're going to draw the apical meristem kind of big. So this is close up of the end of one of the root hairs. And this is the apical meristem. Oh, I spelled that right, didn't I? Whoops. Apical meristem. And basically what is happening here is right on the end of the root tip is where cell division is occurring. And so this is the only part of the roots that are growing. So, hello, mitosis. So this is actually kind of cool. If you look at the very tips of the root hairs under a microscope, you can actually see a whole bunch of cells in various stages of mitosis, and you can recognize all of those different phases that we studied. So that's kind of cool. And this is where the plant grows. As we move up the plant, we're going to look at the structure of the stem. So, if you pick a flower or an herb or something like that, the stem usually is the least exciting part, right? But this is actually the most important part to the plant. It's got a pretty complex vascular system that helps the plant to function, and it does a lot for the plant. There are two main parts to the vascular system of the stem, the xylem and the phloem. So this should sound familiar from the video you watched. So the xylem and the phloem are the pathways. They're kind of like our veins and arteries. So this is how water moves up into the plant and how nutrients move back down from the leaves to the other parts of the plant. All right, we're going to keep the stem structure description pretty simple. And we start from the inside going to the outside. So the very middle of the stem is basically dead. It's not really doing much besides providing structure, and it's called the pith. And surrounding the pith are kind of these bubbles, and these are kind of like the circulatory system of the plant. And there are basically two parts to each of these bubbles. The inner part is the xylem, and the outer part is the phloem. So the xylem moves water up from the roots. So we're going to draw that in blue, and we're going to draw a little water droplet next to the xylem. The xylem brings water up from the roots. The outer part we're going to draw in green, and that is the phloem. And just like in the video, the phloem brings food, food, and it brings nutrients down to the rest of the plant from the leaves that are usually more toward the top of the plant. So the phloem flows down. That's another way I think of it. It flows down. So the phloem is on the outside, xylem's on the inside. Now surrounding the outside of this is the cambium. And the cambium is the only part of the stem that's growing. So this is, again, where cell division is happening. And think of the cambium as this is where tree rings form. So you probably know we use tree rings to figure out the age of a tree. If you count the tree rings, there's one ring for each year of growth for the plant or for the tree. And so what happens is the cambium grows throughout the growing season, and then when the tree goes dormant during the winter, it stops, and a new layer of cambium forms inside of that ring, and the tree continues to grow. And so the more rings you have, the older the tree is, but the other part, the pith, is not growing. Only the cambium is growing. And then finally, the very last layer on the outside, what do you know, is called the epidermis, just like us. So the epidermis is kind of like the bark of a tree. You can think of the epidermis as, just kind of the outside protective layer, just like it is for us. So the phloem brings food down from the leaves, and the food is in the form of a fluid called sap. And the sap is full of glucose, sugars. That's where we get maple syrup from. Maple syrup is tree sap, and it's full of sugars and tastes really good. The xylem is made up of lots of little vessels that go down through the stem, but also out to the leaves and branches, and so can bring water up to the various parts of the plant. So here's an official diagram of the internal stem structure of a plant. You can see there's a little bit more to it than what I explained, but remember the important parts. Xylem's in the middle, brings stuff up. Phloem's on the outside, stuff flows down. And the cambium is around the edges of that. That's the part of the stem that's growing. Pith is in the middle, and the epidermis is around the outside. Let's talk for a minute about leaf structure. So when we think of the leaves, we tend to think of the part of the plant that goes through photosynthesis. This is where lots and lots of chloroplasts are located. And this is the primary purpose of leaves, is to soak in sunlight so that they can do photosynthesis. But another part of the leaf that we haven't talked about very much is the underside of the leaf. So this is the top of the leaf, and it's got lots of chloroplasts, and it's very smooth. The bottom of the leaf is a little bit more rough and often has these little bumps on it. And those bumps are actually called stomata. So stomata perform the function of bringing carbon dioxide into the plant. And if you look at them up close, they actually look like these little mouths. And the mouths can open and close. So when the stomata are closed, that means that they're not bringing in carbon dioxide, but it also means that they're keeping the plant from losing water. And when the stomata are open, this allows carbon dioxide to go into the plant, which is then used for photosynthesis. So the water comes up from the roots, and the CO2 actually comes in through the stomata. If you have houseplants, go take a look. If you look at the bottoms of the leaves, you can usually actually see the stomata without a microscope, without even a magnifying glass. And these little things on the edges are called guard cells. Guard cells. And those cells open and close the stomata. Now, let's look for a minute here at a regular picture. So this is an actual micrograph of the stomata open. And so you can see they look pretty weird under the microscope, but that's their job. They open up and in goes the carbon dioxide. So now we've made it to the top of the plant. So in this particular type of plant, we are drawing a flowering plant. So here's the stem. And as we get to the top, you tend to see this little, it's kind of like a collar around the bottom of the flower. And this little collar is called the calyx. The calyx. And each little leaf of the calyx is called a sepal. Don't you love this vocab? So the calyx just mostly provides support for the flower and helps keep it upright. So now we're going to draw the flower, but we're going to kind of exaggerate it and make it look like it's kind of a cross section because we want to be able to see the middle part. So the main part of the flower that you're used to seeing, those are the petals. But if you see the petals all together as a group, the whole big, beautiful part of the flower is called the corolla. Don't get that confused with a Toyota. So the corolla is just the big flowery part of the flower, and the petals are what make it all flashy and awesome looking. Okay, so in the middle part of the flower, you'll see this weird looking thing that looks kind of like a vase. And that is the female part of the flower. So here's where we should take a minute and talk about the whole point of a flower is reproduction. It uses a lot of energy for the plant, and it really doesn't do much. It doesn't do a lot of photosynthesis. The leaves are mainly in charge of that. So what does the flower do? Well, it attracts pollinators. And pollinators are what help the plant to reproduce. Did I mention that plants are usually male and female? So they're more like us than you thought. So a lot of plants, and the one that we're drawing is like this, have both male and female parts. So it can't reproduce with itself. There's some interesting mechanisms that help to prevent that, but it needs help from pollinators to be able to reproduce with other plants around it. So anyway, going back to the structure, this middle part that looks like a vase is called the pistil, and the pistil is the female part of the plant. And it's got a couple of different parts. So the top part is called the stigma, and the stigma is sticky, and this is so that the pollen can stick to it if a bee lands on it or something like that. So just remember, stigma, sticky. This middle part is called the style. And then down inside here is the ovary. And the ovary is what contains the equivalent to eggs. And that is what the plant uses to reproduce. Now, around the edges of the pistil are the male parts of the plant. And the male part, so this whole thing that looks like a vase is the pistil. All of these little stalks that I just drew all together, those are called the stamens. And you can think of this as men, stamen, get it? So those are the male part of the flower. And there are two main parts to that one, the anther and the filament. So the filament doesn't do anything except hold it up. The anther is the business end. This is where the pollen is located. The pollen is the male gamete. The egg part down in here, these are called ovules. Ovules, okay. So the pollen covers the ends of the anther, and the pollen then is picked up by birds or bees or even the wind and different things, and moved from plant to plant where it will stick to the stigma. The pollen will then stick here and then go down into the ovary where it will fertilize the ovules, and that's what will end up making a seed. And that seed will grow into a baby plant. Isn't that cool? So that's all the parts of a flower. And that's the end of our notes. Now take time to stop and smell the roses.